Two pilots are flying a flight A330 over the Atlantic Ocean. They have done this hundreds of times. It is now midnight and they have been in the air for 4 hours after leaving Canada. Everything seems normal. The pilot is in a good mood and the passengers are asleep. Suddenly, everything changes when they run out of fuel. Imagine being in their position. Both engines fail. All you see around you is darkness, and you are over 120 kilometers away from the nearest airport. What would you do to save the lives of 306 people on board? This is not just a story about an aviation incident. It is about human psychology, process failures, and pilot skills. This is the story of Air Transat Flight 236. It left Toronto, Canada on August 23, 2001, heading to Lisbon, Portugal. The flight was a transatlantic journey with 293 passengers, mostly tourists and holidaymakers preparing for a 7-hour trip. The flight would start in Toronto, fly over Halifax and St. John's, and then land in Lisbon after crossing the Atlantic Ocean. The aircraft was a 2-year-old flight, A330, that had first flown in 1999. It was powered by two Rolls-Royce Trent 772B engines. The captain was 48-year-old Robert Peachy, who had spent 16,800 hours flying in his 20-year career, with around 800 hours on the A330. He was the main pilot for this leg. The first officer, Dirk Dejager, was 28 years old and had 4,800 hours of flying experience. At the time of the incident, Air Transat had been operational for 14 years and had an excellent safety record with no previous accidents. But today, that was about to change. The crew loaded 4,900 kilograms of fuel, which was 4,500 kilograms more than the minimum requirement. They planned the flight and requested pushback from the gate. They taxied to the runway and took off at 9 p.m. local time. Although the A330 was fully computerized, the crew needed to manually calculate fuel levels at specific points during the flight. They completed these checks at 50 degrees north and 40 degrees west. About 4 hours into the flight, as they crossed 30 degrees west, the crew was reminded to complete the checklist again. The aircraft's fuel weight was 216 tons, which was within expected values. However, the pilots were unaware that a serious issue was developing in their flight. 6 minutes later at 5 p.m., the crew received an unusual warning on their screens. There is a problem with engine 2. I see low oil quantity, high oil pressure, and low oil temperature. Normally, oil temperature only increases and does not drop. Low oil temperature readings usually indicate a faulty sensor, while high oil pressure is rare. When that happens, it usually means the oil is contaminated with fuel. However, this was not explained in the Flight A330 manual. The crew decided to contact the help team at the maintenance center. They reported Transat 236 has a problem. We have an oil temperature warning for engine 2, but there is no information in the manual. Can you assist? However, the maintenance crew also could not identify the root cause and advised the pilots to monitor the oil levels. Here, human psychology played a significant role. The previous checks indicated that fuel levels were fine, the left engine was okay, and low oil temperature readings were typically due to faulty sensors. The pilots thought they were just experiencing a computer glitch and believed their aircraft was functioning correctly, so they decided to continue flying. To understand the rest of the story, you need to know how the fuel tanks work. The Flight A330 holds fuel in its wings. The left wing has a tank that feeds the left engine, and the right wing has a tank that feeds the right engine. There is also a trim tank in the horizontal stabilizers. The trim tank's purpose is to maintain the aircraft's center of gravity at all times. As fuel burns during the flight, the weight near the wings decreases, which causes the rear of the aircraft to become heavier, shifting the center of gravity backward. When this happens, the flight computer automatically pushes fuel from the trim tank into the wing tanks to maintain the center of gravity. The pilots receive a trim tank transfer message on their screens. Here is another example of human psychology and decision-making. The pilots were used to seeing this message on regular flights, so they assumed it was routine and failed to realize it was occurring an hour earlier than expected. They did not recognize that a major fuel leak was happening in their right engine. 1 week before the incident, Flight Air Transat maintenance staff identified some issues with the original right engine and decided to replace it with a different engine. Rolls-Royce provided them with a spare engine, but this borrowed engine was an older variant and did not fit properly due to differences in fuel and hydraulic lines. Nevertheless, the maintenance staff forced the two lines to fit and installed the engine back into the aircraft, and after 68 hours of flight time when the aircraft was crossing the Atlantic, the fuel pump failed. At that time, fuel had been leaking for over 30 minutes, but the trim tank was automatically filling the tank to maintain the center of gravity, so the pilots were unaware of the fuel leak. Their next manual check for fuel levels was planned for when they reached 20 degrees west, which was still 20 minutes away. Due to the leak, the right tank's fuel was rapidly decreasing compared to the left tank, but when the final trim tank transfer occurred, the trim tank transferred all the fuel from the left tank to the right tank, leaving no fuel for topping up. At 5:33 p.m., the ECAM screen displayed a fuel imbalance message. By this time, the flight crew became aware of the imbalance between the left and right fuel tanks. However, they still did not consider the possibility of a fuel leak, as leaks are very rare scenarios. Confirmation bias began to play a role. They had already convinced themselves that the right tank was low on fuel because the right engine was consuming more fuel than normal. In response to the fuel imbalance message, the crew decided to cross-feed fuel from the left tank to the right tank to maintain balance. The captain carried out this action from memory, but forgot that the checklist had a warning stating not to cross-feed if a fuel leak was suspected. This action worsened the problem. A few minutes later, the crew calculated that the fuel level on the aircraft was down to 11,000 kilograms, when they should have had around 20,000 kilograms of fuel remaining. The pilots had never faced a fuel leak or a clear low fuel warning before. As the flight progressed toward Portugal, the fuel levels continued to drop. The crew calculated that they did not have enough fuel to reach Lisbon and decided to divert to the nearest large airport. They informed air traffic control that they were changing their destination due to low fuel and that they only had 7,000 kilograms of fuel left. The captain asked the cabin crew to visually check the engines and wings for evidence of a fuel leak, as leaks would be visibly apparent during the day, but were almost impossible to detect at night. The cabin crew returned to report that there was no visible fuel leak on the wings. The captain thought it was likely a computer error, but instructed them to prepare for landing at the nearest large airport. However, the aircraft's fuel was rapidly diminishing and had now dropped to 4,800 kilograms, which was 12,000 kilograms below planned fuel. 10 minutes later, 250 kilometers away from the nearest airport, the right engine suddenly stopped working. 2 minutes later, the fuel level dropped to 600 kilograms. The first officer declared a mayday with air traffic control, announcing an emergency situation. The Flight A330 is rated to fly for 180 minutes on one engine, which should have given them plenty of time unless something else went wrong. The crew believed they could safely land the aircraft. But just 120 kilometers away from the runway, the left engine also failed. Instead of the roar of the engines, there was now a terrifying silence. Due to the loss of pressure, oxygen masks dropped, and the ram air turbine was deployed to provide electricity to critical instruments. Without power, Air Transat Flight 236 was now only a glider. If you have ever tried to steer a car without power steering, you can imagine how difficult it was for Captain Peachy to control the aircraft. He had one chance to land the plane safely. The captain had to fly the aircraft very carefully. If they flew above 200 knots, they would not be able to lower the landing gear. If they flew below 140 knots, the ram turbine would not generate power, and if they made any mistakes in their calculations, the aircraft could end up in the water. With assistance from air traffic control, military air traffic controllers, and radar vectors, the crew adopted a visual approach without engines. The weather was good, which worked in their favor, and the crew estimated they had about 15 to 20 minutes before they would be forced to land in the ocean. To help identify the airport, they requested air traffic control to flash the runway lights. At 6:31 p.m., the aircraft reached an altitude of 13,000 feet, about 8 miles from runway 33. They were too high and needed to lose altitude quickly. The captain made a risky decision to turn 360 degrees to lose altitude, but successfully executed the maneuver. However, they still needed to descend quickly as they approached the runway. At just a few miles from the runway, they landed at approximately 200 knots, but they bounced on touchdown. The aircraft skidded off the runway and came to a stop 2,000 feet from the end. A small fire broke out due to damage to the landing gear, but emergency vehicles extinguished it quickly. The final report indicated that the incident resulted from a combination of poor maintenance practices and the crew's failure to recognize the fuel leak. Air Transat accepted responsibility for the incident and was fined $250,000 Canadians, which was the largest penalty in Canada's history at the time. Captain Peachy later received the Superior Airmanship Award for his extraordinary ability to land the aircraft safely without engines. If you enjoyed this story, visit our channel. There is more stories like this on our channel. Let's meet there next time.